Ranger's Apprentice, Book 2, The Burning Bridge. Prologue. Halt and Will had been trailing the wargles for 3 days. The 4 heavy-bodied brutish creatures, foot soldiers of the rebel warlord Morgoth, had been sighted passing through Redmont Fife, heading north. Once word reached the ranger, he had set out to intercept them, accompanied by his young apprentice. "Where could they have come from, Halt?" Will asked during one of their short rest stops. "Surely we've got 3-Step Pass well and truly bottled up by now." 3-Step Pass provided the only real access between the kingdom of Araluan and the mountains of Rain and Night, where Morgoth had his headquarters. Now that the kingdom was preparing for the coming war with Morgoth, a company of infantry and archers had been sent to reinforce the small permanent garrison at the narrow pass until the main army could assemble. "That's the only place where they could have come in sizable numbers," Halt agreed. "But a small party like this could slip into the kingdom by way of the barrier cliffs." Morgoth's domain was an inhospitable mountain plateau that towered high above the southern reaches of the kingdom. From 3-Step Pass in the east, a line of sheer, precipitous cliffs ran roughly due west, forming the border between the plateau and Araluan. As the cliffs swung southwest, they plunged into another obstacle called the Fissure, a huge split in the earth that ran out to the sea and separated Morgoth's lands from the kingdom of the Celts. It was these natural fortifications that had kept Araluan, and neighboring Celtica, safe from Morgoth's armies for the past 16 years. Conversely, they also provided the rebel warlord with protection from Araluan's forces. "I thought those cliffs were impassable," Will said. Halt allowed himself a grim smile. "Nowhere is ever really impassable, particularly if you have no respect for how many lives you lose trying to prove the fact. My guess is they used ropes and grapnels and waited for a moonless night and bad weather. That way they could slip past the border patrols." He stood, signifying that the rest stop was at an end. Will rose with him, and they moved toward their horses. Halt gave a small grunt as he swung into the saddle. The wound he had suffered in the battle with the 2 Kalkara still troubled him a little. "My main concern isn't where they came from," he continued. "It's where they're heading, and what they have in mind." The words were barely spoken when they heard a shout coming from somewhere ahead of them, followed by a commotion of grunting, and finally the clash of weapons. "And we may be about to find out," Halt finished. He urged Abelard into a gallop, controlling the horse with his knees as his hands effortlessly selected an arrow and knocked it to the string of his massive longbow. Will scrambled into Tug's saddle and galloped after him. He couldn't match Halt's hands-free riding skill. He needed his right hand for his reins, and he held his own bow ready in his left. They were riding through the sparse woodland, leaving it to the sure-footed ranger horses to pick the best route. Suddenly they burst clear of the trees into a wide meadow. Abelard, under his rider's urging, slid to a stop, Tug following suit behind him. Dropping the reins to Tug's neck, Will instinctively reached for an arrow from his quiver and knocked it ready. A large fig tree grew in the middle of the clear ground. At the base of it there was a small camp. A wisp of smoke still curled from the fireplace, and a pack and blanket roll lay beside it. The 4 wargles they had been tracking surrounded a single man, who had his back to the tree. For the moment his longsword held them at bay, but the wargles were making small feinting movements towards him, trying to find an advantage. They were armed with short swords and axes, and one carried a heavy iron spear. Will drew in a sharp breath at the sight of the creatures. After following their trail for so long, it was a shock to come upon them so suddenly in plain sight. Bear-like in build, they had long muzzles and massive yellow canine fangs, exposed now as they snarled at their prey. They were covered in shaggy fur and wore black leather armor. The man was dressed similarly, and his voice cracked in fear as he repelled their tentative attacks. "Stand back! I'm on a mission from Lord Morgoth! Stand back, I order you! I order you in Lord Morgoth's name!" Halt nudged Abelard around, allowing him room to draw the arrow he had already on the string. "Drop your weapons, all of you!" he shouted. 5 pairs of eyes swung up from him as the 4 wargles and their prey turned in surprise. The wargle with the spear recovered first. Realizing that the swordsman was distracted, he darted forward and rammed the spear into his body. A second later, Halt's arrow buried itself in the wargle's heart, and he fell dead beside his stricken prey. As the swordsman sank to his knees, the other wargles charged at the 2 rangers. Shambling and bear-like as they might be, they covered ground with incredible speed. Halt's second shot dropped the left-hand wargle. Will fired at the one on the right and realized instantly that he had misjudged the brute's speed. The arrow hissed through the space where the wargle had been a second before. His hand flew to his quiver for another arrow, and he heard a hoarse grunt of pain as Halt's third shot buried itself in the chest of the middle creature. Then Will loosed his second arrow at the surviving wargle, now terrifyingly close. Panicked by those savage eyes and yellow fangs, he snatched as he released the arrow, and knew it would fly wide. As the wargle snarled in triumph, Tug came to his master's aid. The little horse reared and lashed out with its front hooves at the horrific creature in front of him. Unexpectedly, he also danced forward a few steps toward the threat rather than retreating. Will, caught by surprise, clung to the pommel of the saddle. The wargle was equally surprised. Like all its kind, it had a deep-seated instinctive fear of horses, a fear born at the Battle of Hackham Heath 16 years ago, where Morgoth's first wargle army had been decimated by Araulian cavalry. It hesitated now for a fatal second, stepping back before those flashing hooves. Halt's fourth arrow took him in the throat. At such short range, the arrow tore clean through. With a final grunting shriek, the wargle fell dead in the grass. White-faced, Will slid to the ground, his knees nearly giving way beneath him. He clung to Tug's side to stay upright. Halt swung down quickly and moved to the boy's side. His arm went around him. "It's all right, Will." His deep voice cut through the fear that filled Will's mind. "It's over now." But Will shook his head, horrified by the rapid train of events. "Halt! I missed. Twice. I panicked, and I missed." He felt a deep sense of shame that he had let his teacher down so badly. Halt's arm tightened around him, and he looked up at the bearded face and the dark, deep-set eyes. "There's a big difference between shooting at a target and shooting at a charging wargle. A target isn't usually trying to kill you." Halt added the last few words in a more gentle tone. He could see that Will was in shock, and no wonder, he thought grimly. "But I missed." "And next time you won't. Now that you know, it's better to fire one good shot than two hurried ones," Halt said firmly. Then he took Will's arm and turned him toward the campsite under the fig tree. "Now, let's see what we have here," he said, putting an end to the subject. The black-clad man and the wargle lay dead beside one another. Halt knelt beside the man and turned him over, whistling softly as he did in surprise. "Dirk creature," he said half to himself. "He's the last person I would have expected to see here." "You know him?" Will asked. His insatiable curiosity was already helping him put the horror of the previous few minutes to one side, as Halt had known it would. "I chased him out of the kingdom 5 or 6 years ago," the ranger told him. "He was a coward and a murderer. He deserted the army and found a place with Morgoth." He paused. "Morgoth seems to specialize in recruiting people like him. But what was he doing here?" "He said he was on a mission for Morgoth," Will suggested, but Halt shook his head. "Unlikely. The wargles were chasing him, and only Morgoth would have ordered them to do that. Which he'd hardly do if Reacher was really working for him. My guess is he was deserting again. He'd run out on Morgoth and the wargles were sent after him." "Why?" Will asked. "Why desert?" Halt shrugged. "There's a war coming. People like Dirk try to avoid that sort of unpleasantness." He reached for the pack that lay by the campfire and began to rummage through it. "Are you looking for anything in particular?" Will asked. Halt frowned as he grew tired of looking through the pack and dumped its contents onto the ground instead. "Well, it strikes me that if he were deserting Morgoth and coming back to Araulian, he'd have to bring something to bargain for his freedom. So—" His voice died away as he reached for a carefully folded parchment among the spare clothes and eating utensils. He scanned it quickly. One eyebrow rose slightly. After almost a year with the grizzled ranger, Will knew that this was the equivalent of a shout of astonishment. He also knew that if he interrupted Halt before he had finished reading, his mentor would simply ignore him. He waited until Halt folded the parchment, stood slowly, and looked at his apprentice, seeing the question in the boy's eyes. "Is it important?" Will asked. "Oh, you could say so," Halt told him. "We appear to have stumbled on Morgoth's battle plans for the coming war. I think we'd better get them back to Redmont." He whistled softly, and Abelard and Tug trotted to where their masters waited. From the trees, several hundred meters away, carefully downwind so the ranger horses would catch no scent of an intruder, unfriendly eyes were upon them. Their owner watched as the two rangers rode away from the scene of the small battle. Then he turned south, toward the cliffs. It was time to report to Morgoth. His plan had been successful.